right, hello everyone, welcome. It is shortly after 11 o'clock, at least where we are in the world, so we are going to get started. Thank you all for being here. My name is Helen Schroeder. I'm the marketing coordinator at Sigma Assessment Systems, and I will be co-facilitating your webinar today with my colleague Shruti Kumar. For those of you who are new to Sigma, we're a professional services firm that offers talent development, succession planning, and psychological assessments for organizations who are looking to build their internal talent pools. Sigma has been in business for over 50 years, so as a company, we have a lot of experience, and we're happy to be bringing that to you today. Today, we'll be talking about succession planning, and in particular, how to identify critical roles. We've got about 60 minutes together. For the first 45 minutes or so, Shruti will walk you through the webinar content to introduce critical roles in succession planning, discuss what they are, how to identify them, and how you can apply some of these tools at your organization. We will be recording the session and sharing a recording as well as a copy of the slides afterwards, so no need to take frantic notes. And as we go through the session, feel free to post any questions that you have in the Q&A bar. I will be monitoring those and we'll save some time at the end to go through them together. You can also continue to ask questions once we get there, but if you want to just type them out while we go, you're welcome to do that. If there's something that we don't get to in our session together, you're welcome to follow up with us via email. But for now, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A box. That's what it's there for. And without any further ado, let me introduce you to our presenter today. Shruti has a master's in industrial organizational psychology from Western University. She's a member of our consulting team, and here she applies her passion and expertise to create evidence-based content on organizational best practices. Shruti largely develops resources and facilitates presentations designed to support leadership development and succession planning efforts, such as this webinar today. Through this work, Shruti's main goal is to help clients gain knowledge, feel more confident, and achieve success in the workplace. So Shruti, thank you for being with us today, and I'll pass it off to you to get started.
Thank you, Helen, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be chatting with you all today about how to identify critical roles in your organization's succession program. So I'll be covering the basics of what critical roles are, how they fit into a succession planning process, and why your organization would benefit from identifying critical roles. I'll then give you some more details as to how to actually go about this, because although it may seem like a relatively straightforward process, there are a few different factors and challenges that you should consider. I'll also be giving you some guidelines as to how to navigate these mistakes, and we'll be having a discussion at the end about critical positions versus critical people. All right. So I do want to note that we'll be discussing critical roles in the context of succession planning, but the information that I'm providing today is also relevant for talent development planning or other strategic initiatives. Now let's spend some time learning about the succession process itself. So before we do so, I would love to get some audience participation here. So we're going to be doing a few polls throughout the session. So this is our first one. So let me just start the poll. So you can scan the QR code if you have your phone handy. Otherwise, you can join us at menti.com, so menti.com, and you can use the code that's on the screen. So 5623 6627. Now, you can use your phone or perhaps another browser on your computer to access this poll. And I want to hear about your experience within your own company. So does your organization have a formal succession planning process? And I'll give you a few moments to answer this poll. Once you answer the question, you will have to hit submit for it to populate on my screen. And if the correct question isn't coming up, you may just need to refresh your screen. Oh, pardon me. I'll give it about another 20 seconds or so because I see the results are still trickling in. All right, so it seems like most of you at your company do have a few replacements in mind, especially for those people that may be leaving soon. And some of you do have a formal succession planning process in place, which is amazing. And some of you have teams that are engaging in succession, but there's no standardized process. So at Sigma, we take a long-term and structured approach to succession planning, and identifying critical roles is only the first step in this process. So we use a six-step process, and I'll cover what this actually looks like in the upcoming slides. Thank you all for your participation, and let's find out more about succession planning. All right, so succession planning is not just about having a list of adequate or convenient candidates who may one day replace employees as they're leaving the company. Succession planning is a process of identifying and actually developing individuals in your organization who have the potential to fill key roles when your current employees are promoted to another role or perhaps when they leave your company. So, this identifying and developing actually goes beyond simply having a list, and it's a more deliberate approach. So, it's a process that does require time and effort, but we would argue that this is a necessary investment. So, turnover is an inevitable part of the organizational life cycle. And when this occurs, organizations without a succession plan in place often scramble to fill vacancies, and often they rely on replacement hiring. When you're hiring from outside the organization, you not only need to go through, the recruitment phase, screening, interviewing, hiring, you also need to train and actually develop these employees and give them time to adjust to the workplace culture and to gain the knowledge that's specific to your organization. So overall, this can make for a clunky, a slow transition. Now, with succession planning, you would take a more proactive, strategic, and an intentional approach, and you prepare your best internal candidates for a role before they are even needed. This can ensure a more seamless role transition. Now, to achieve the best outcomes with succession planning, we recommend that you follow a structured plan. So for those of you who don't follow a structured plan at your organizations yet, let's cover some of the benefits of doing this. So for instance, a structured plan involves providing employees who are actually chosen for succession with development goals and resources that they need for their professional growth. This demonstrates your investment in your employees and it empowers them to be fully prepared for their new roles, and it helps keep them accountable to their own professional development. Now, developing your talent pool before it's needed also helps in retaining that organizational specific knowledge, and it increases your organizational resiliency as your business can then anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changes. Now, with a structured plan, this also often facilitates communication and transparency. So, when you have employees who are not selected for succession, but who understand how the process works, they tend to view it as a fair process and they remain engaged in their own roles. When opportunities for advancement are provided based on objective decisions, your organization can also avoid inadvertently contributing to workplace inequalities, and it can maintain its legal defensibility. So those are the benefits, but what does this process actually look like? So as I mentioned, Sigma has a six-step succession planning process. So our focus today is on the first stage, but I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So I'll briefly guide you through the overall process. Now, the first step is why you're here today. So identifying the key positions that you'll be including in your plan. Now, this might seem like a pretty simple thing to do, but there are many factors that you may want to consider, and it's important to take the time to do this well because it lays the foundation for your overall plan. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what those factors that you should be considering actually are in the upcoming slides. Now, moving on to the second step, you would then build success profiles, which are separate profiles for each of the critical roles that you've identified. So these success profiles contain information about the competencies that are necessary to perform the role, both at present as well as in the near future, according to your organization's evolving and anticipated needs. You would then consider potential candidates for each of the critical roles and nominate your successors. And then you would assess their development needs by identifying the gaps between their current skill set and the competencies that they need for their next role. By identifying these gaps, you can then begin to consider how your organization is going to prioritize opportunities for growth and development. So following this, you would actually go about developing your internal talent. And so this involves creating development plans for each of your succession candidates and potentially coaching them to work towards skill attainment. Now, the last component of the process is to measure progress. So measuring progress involves quantifying success and tracking candidate growth. Now, this is a good opportunity to reflect on the progress that you've made so far and address any remaining skill gaps. Now, although I've presented this as a linear process, it's actually a little bit more dynamic, and so you may move back and forth between the steps as needed. All right, so let's zoom back into the first stage of identifying those critical roles. Now, because there is a structured process here, you want to be really thoughtful at the first stage, as it does lay the foundation for the rest of your plan. So a deeper understanding of what critical roles are and how you can go about selecting these roles will really help to strengthen your overall succession program. So what are these critical roles that we're talking about today? Critical roles are those that have the greatest impact on an organization's performance. So you might be thinking at this point that every role in your organization is important for success. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. Now, every position is valuable to our organizations. But when we're talking about critical roles in the context of succession planning, we want to prioritize our efforts to a smaller number of roles. Realistically, you're not going to be able to focus on every single role in your organization, or at least not right away. So this is why organizations often go through multiple rounds of succession planning. This may also be the case when organizations are going through periods of change, and so critical roles may actually evolve over time. So generally, critical roles include executive and other leadership positions, as well as linchpin roles across your organization. It's really important at this stage to think about who has that invaluable information for your organization and would be difficult to replace. And you're not going to focus only at the top of the hierarchy, as it's very likely that you do have those critical roles throughout your organization. Now, I did say that you won't be able to focus on everyone right away, but you also want to make sure that you don't have any blind spots due to your familiarity with certain roles or certain areas in your organization. Once you've selected those critical roles, you would then prioritize them in your organization's succession plan, and this will help you to take a more manageable and realistic approach to the rest of the process. So to further consider the value of identifying critical roles, let's consider a hypothetical case study. So meet Sarah on our screen. So Sarah is a hypothetical employee in a hypothetical organization, and she was a very high-performing employee in a project management role. So specifically, her role involved identifying project objectives, creating project plans, reviewing and approving the resources needed, monitoring progress, and communicating with key stakeholders. Now, Sarah had been with her company for a few years, and she was managing projects that brought in a lot of revenue. Her role required a complex mix of interpersonal and technical skills, and also involved a high degree of institutional knowledge. Now, her organization, in fact, did implement a succession plan, but their process did not involve identifying those critical roles. And so Sarah's role was overlooked because of a focus on higher level executives. So we can consider this from the employee's perspective. Sarah was, in fact, very happy in her role to begin with, but she eventually felt she was not being valued by her organization. She noticed she did really well in performance reviews, but there was no discussion of long-term development or of succession opportunities. And as we know, the organization was going through succession planning, but when Sarah asked about this, information wasn't really clearly provided. So Sarah eventually decided to leave the organization, and when she did, she took vital organizational knowledge with her. And she left a talent gap as well, not only for her own role, but also for the project manager director position, which no longer had a strong succession candidate available for it. So the leadership team eventually realized how critical this role was, and they then had to rely on that costly external hiring process. So that recruitment, screening, negotiating, training. The external hire, of course, also needed time to adjust to the new role. And so this transition had a significant impact on the workplace flow and productivity. Now, overlooking Sarah's critical role had a negative impact both on Sarah while she was with the organization, as well as on the organization itself once she left. Now, you're not going to be able to realistically focus your succession efforts on every important role in your organization. However, when you identify critical roles, it can help you to make a more informed decision rather than making a decision based on an assumption that you should start at the top. Taking a structured approach also often tends to foster transparent communication that helps keep employees in the loop and engaged in their roles. So we've covered some of the benefits of succession planning in general, but how does taking the time to identify critical roles actually strengthen this overall process? So primarily, it helps leaders in prioritizing their succession planning efforts. And beyond this, identifying critical roles can also be important for helping your organization recognizing the roles that have a strong impact, understanding which roles require specialized abilities or unique knowledge, and also identifying those positions that might become vacant soon because the employee in the role is perhaps nearing retirement age. Now, this leads to long-term benefits as well, some of them that we've already discussed. So investing in your employees' growth and development, being able to confidently fill vacancies with your best internal talent, and retaining that organizational knowledge. And all of these short and long-term benefits really work to improve your organizational resiliency. However, it all starts from the very first step of carefully identifying critical roles. All right, so I've given you a broad introduction to succession planning in general, as well as to identifying those critical roles. And so let's dive deeper into this process. All right, I do have another poll. So I'm very curious to hear from our audience. Does your organization know which roles are critical within your organization? And so you can again scan that QR code. If you want, you can leave your browser or your phone handy because every time I start a new poll, it will move to the next question. And if it's not showing this question, then you can refresh your screen. And I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for your participation so far. It's really helpful for us to hear about your specific experiences because then we can tailor some of our offerings for you. All right, so it seems like we still have some answers trickling in, but I'll review what we have so far. So it looks like most of you, your organization does have a general idea about which roles are critical. And some of you have said that there is no shared understanding of which roles are critical. All right, so I'm going to provide you with some specific factors that your organization can use to actually go about identifying critical roles. And hopefully this will help you in strengthening your overall succession process. I'll also be giving you some tools that we offer that can support you in your succession program. All right, thank you everyone for your participation. I'm going to move on now. A lot of answers trickling in, or perhaps it's lagging on my end. My apologies. Thank you again, everyone. All right, so we do offer a questionnaire that can help you to identify those critical roles in your organization. And so there are 5 key factors that you'll be asked to evaluate. So I'll summarize them now and then I'll go over them in more detail. Now, first we have urgency of need, referring to how likely it is that a role is going to be vacant soon. You'll then evaluate the impact of the vacancy on your business operations. Next, you'll evaluate the unique skill set or the knowledge base that's required for the role. The final 2 criteria have to do with your internal and external talent. So first is the internal bench strength, referring to how long it would take for internal candidates to become ready to fill each role. And then the availability of the external candidates refers to how long it would take to find and train those external hires. All right, so this is what our critical role identification questionnaire actually looks like. So a long name for a very handy questionnaire. Now, at your organization, your senior leadership team or your succession management team would come together and use this to pinpoint the positions that are most valuable for your organization's operations. So, if you're on the succession management team, for instance, you would you would start from the left-hand side to list anyone whose role you think may be critical. So you may find that certain leaders or certain managers are immediately jumping to mind. But as we discussed, it's better to be exhaustive at this step in order to avoid any blind spots or mistakes. And so you can also include roles that you might be less familiar with. Now, this evaluation process will help you to learn more about the role and then narrow the roles down to the truly most critical. So list each of the roles that you are considering. But keep in mind that when you're evaluating critical roles, you want to consider more so the position description rather than focus overtly on the person currently in the role. So, strong employees often tend to take on additional responsibilities that go a little bit outside their job scope. But you want to base your evaluation on the criticality of their core function, so the core function of their role. So I would recommend that you list job titles rather than the name of the incumbent. So you'll then go through the rest of the columns to evaluate the position on the criteria. So you'll be providing ratings from 1 to 5. So not true of this role all the way to extremely true of this role. So as you score each of the positions, the number in the total column will auto-populate. So you can use this number to decide on the roles that are critical. This will involve speaking within your succession management team to establish a minimum threshold score. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. Now, in the final column, you would then indicate the critical role by adding a little star. So let's discuss each of these criteria. So you'll first evaluate urgency. So how likely is it that a role is going to be vacant soon? Now, you can't always know for sure how soon that role might become vacant, but you can take your best guess based on conversations that you've had with the employee or perhaps their eligibility to retire. So, roles where the employee is planning to stay for more than 5 or more years could be considered lower urgency. But if you know the employee will be planning to leave within a couple of years, this would be considered urgent. Now, you may also consider that while employees may not be explicitly planning to leave, they could potentially be offered a role elsewhere. So this is in the cases when you have a very competitive a very competitive employee with a highly sought after skill set. So if you do have a superstar employee at your organization, you want to be aware that they could be headhunted, so approached by other organizations. So you can also keep this in mind when you're making your evaluations. You'll then move on to evaluating impact. So the extent to which a vacancy would affect your organization. Now, impactful roles are those that allow your business to operate as per usual, and it often includes senior decision makers. However, impactful roles may not always be the most obvious, so you want to take the time to consider whether an overlooked position might really be a critical point of support. So remember that case study we discussed earlier, the project management role may have been considered a critical role. So the stronger the impact, the higher you would rate this role for this criterion. You'll then evaluate whether the role requires any specialized skills or knowledge. So this may be readily apparent in certain roles, but it can also be a little bit easy to overlook. So perhaps there are roles that you're less familiar with, or perhaps you have a strong employee in a role who's doing their job so well that you take for granted what goes into the role. So you might consider a software management role that involves a wide scope of responsibilities and intimate knowledge of software uniquely used by your organization. Now, let's say that the employee in this role had been with your company for a long time, so it's easy for them to navigate their day-to-day tasks, but they've actually built their expertise over time. So you may want to consider rating them higher on this criterion. Now, keep in mind that having a better understanding of the level of skills and knowledge that is necessary for a role, it's important beyond identifying critical roles because you would use this information throughout your succession process. So when you're nominating those qualified succession candidates, when you're identifying skill gaps and setting development goals for them, and if you need to recruit from outside of the organization, this becomes relevant then as well. Now, the next two criteria have to do with your internal and external talent evaluation. So you'll first evaluate internal bench strength. So this refers to both the number of succession candidates that you have available, as well as their readiness to fill the role. So the higher the rating here, the more difficult that you anticipate filling the role with internal candidates. So if you have multiple succession candidates who will be ready within a couple of years, you could rate them lower. But if you don't have many candidates, or those that you do have wouldn't be ready for several years, you could rate this a little bit higher. And of course, if you have absolutely no possible succession candidates, you could rate this a 5. Now, I do want to briefly mention that the column total for this internal talent criterion, it's an indicator of your organization's succession bench. So a succession bench is a valuable tool for monitoring and managing your organization's leadership pipelines. So we won't spend time reviewing this in more depth today, but if you are interested in learning more about succession benches, you can head over to our website and you can feel free to email us if you have any questions as you are learning more about this. All right, so finally, you'll be evaluating the availability of external talent. Now, I've mentioned before, relying on external hiring to fill critical roles leaves you at the mercy of the labor market, and it may be less cost effective than internal hiring or internal promotion, I should say. However, I acknowledge that some cases will inevitably require you to look beyond your organization. So it's important to know just how difficult it might be to fill a critical role with employees from outside of your organization. So a higher score here would indicate greater difficulty in finding and training those external hires. A higher score also suggests a stronger need for succession planning and specifically internal talent development. So, for instance, let's consider perhaps there's a competitive labor market for a specific role, or you know that it's quite difficult to find applicants with the specific experience that you're looking for. So, in that case, you might want to consider whether there are junior employees within your organization who might be good candidates for long-term development. All right, so once you've evaluated each of those criteria, you'll need to mark the roles that you've identified as critical. Now, the total possible score for each role on this questionnaire is 25, and so a higher score indicates a greater need for succession planning. So, your organization, your succession management team, will need to decide beforehand on a minimum threshold for deciding on the roles that you're considering as critical based on the total score. So, the minimum threshold really depends on the needs of your organization as well as the resources that you have available for succession planning. So the minimum threshold, you might consider using a score of anywhere from 16 to 20 as a default cutoff. And so these are the roles that might be more urgent, impactful, specialized, and with little internal or external talent available. You can also set the threshold as higher or lower. And in fact, the lower you set your threshold, the more proactive and risk adverse your succession planning process will be. Now, if you've set your threshold lower, or to be honest, at any level, you may end up with more roles to start than you can realistically work on at once. So, if this is the case for your organization, we recommend getting together as a succession management team or as a leadership team to discuss which roles you really need to be prioritizing initially. Keep in mind that by starting small, you make the process easier to manage and improve your likelihood of creating a successful plan. It also gives your organization a chance to learn and to gain insights before expanding the scope of your succession plan. So once you've prioritized and narrowed down that list, you can remember that you can always come back to this questionnaire if you're going to be going through multiple rounds of succession planning. All right, so I've given you a lot of information so far, but there are still some challenges that you may be facing in identifying critical roles. So let's cover some of these as well. But first, again, I'm very curious about your own potential expectations when it comes to mistakes. So, what potential mistakes do you anticipate that your organization might make in identifying critical roles? So I'll give about 45 seconds. Now you'll see with this poll that you can actually select multiple options. And so these mistakes are some common mistakes that we've seen based on Sigma's work with clients in the past. So identifying critical roles may seem simple in theory, but organizations are unique and complex, and there isn't always a simple answer. So mistakes can sometimes be inevitable. Thank you all for your participation. So some varied challenges here. All right, with a lot of responses saying perhaps the organization would only respond to urgent need, or perhaps underestimate how difficult it will be to fill a role. All right, so let's chat about each of these in more detail. So again, although I've given you guidelines for identifying critical roles, oftentimes organizations can face uncertainty or time pressure, and this may lead to some specific mistakes. So let's talk about how we can avoid these mistakes. So the first one here is assuming that only executive positions are critical. Now we've discussed this already, right? So we know that we can avoid this by starting with a broader list of potential critical roles. So it's entirely possible that even with starting with a broad list, once you've evaluated each of the criteria, perhaps you end up with only those executive roles. However, I want to emphasize that the difference here is that you're making an informed decision rather than basing your succession plan on an assumption. So although you do have to go through the effort of completing the questionnaire, you do end up with a better understanding of your workforce by learning things like which roles require specialized abilities, which positions may be vacant soon, and which may require long-term development due to low talent availability. So, on a related note, the next mistake is overlooking those roles that require complex skills or unique knowledge. Now, this may occur because your succession management team is more familiar with certain roles or have certain blind spots. This can also occur when you have really strong employees who are so good at their jobs that you take for granted what goes into their role. So, like with the past mistake, the previous mistake, this is why it's important to take an exhaustive approach. So you can list as many roles as you want to, and you can spend some time learning more about your workforce. And then going through the criteria will really help you to narrow the list down. All right, so this next mistake has to do with taking an ad hoc, reactive approach to urgent vacancies. So rather than spending time on proactively planning for talent development, you're only dealing with situations as they arise. Now, this can create a lot of disruption in your organization, and it really impacts your organizational functioning and organization success. So, with that proactive and intentional long-term approach, you can actually make very well thought out, objective, and even efficient decisions, and you can act in line with your organization's vision and values. All right, so our approach to identifying critical roles involves an evaluation of internal and external talent. So this may actually be more challenging than you would expect, but there are a number of questions that you can reflect on or spend some time looking into. So for internal talent, who do you have available who might be able to fill that role? How long would it take to prepare those individuals? If you need to hire externally, how many organizations are hiring for a similar position? And is your organization a competitive employer for candidates? How difficult would it be to hire and onboard those external candidates? So, spending the time thinking through these questions will greatly benefit you in the long run. Now, the final mistake that I want to talk about is trying to find an exact replica of the current job holder, so of the incumbent. So when you're creating succession plans, we want to focus on roles rather than trying to replace or to replicate people using a cookie cutter approach. So let's talk about this one in more depth. Now, I first want to highlight here that there's a difference between a critical person and a critical role. So many organizations have critical people, So, critical people may wear multiple hats and they complete a variety of tasks essential for keeping your business afloat. So, you may identify a role as critical because the current employee in that role is so valuable to your organization. Now, critical people can, in fact, help guide you in identifying those critical roles. But you want to keep in mind that the purpose of succession planning is to prepare individuals for stepping into positions rather than trying to promote or hire a cookie cutter replica of the current incumbent. Now, looking at the bigger picture, you also may find it difficult to create a succession plan for those critical superheroes who seem to do it all. So, this may be a sign that their role actually needs to be broken down into two or more distinct critical positions. So, this will not only help in creating a clear succession plan, but it also helps your organization in avoiding a catastrophic loss of talent if your rockstar employee becomes burnt out or decides to leave your company. All right, so we're almost at the end here, and I really appreciate you all sticking with me. So we do have a Q&A portion coming up very soon, but I want to reinforce some of the things that we've talked about so far. So again, identifying critical roles is important, but it's only the first step in your succession program. So the goal of identifying those critical roles is to highlight the roles that your organization will be targeting in the rest of the process. So we've not covered that process in depth today, but we do offer plenty of free resources that you can use in your succession program. So these free resources are a part of our template library, and they're listed on the screen in the green text. So you can head on over to our website and you can take a look at the worksheets and the templates that we offer. We also have several blog posts on relevant succession topics, and this includes a blog post on identifying critical roles, which summarizes some of what we've discussed today. Now, if you can't find something or if you have any questions about the content as you're reviewing it, feel free to reach out to us and we're always happy to chat. All right, one last poll here. Let me start this one. All right, so what are the greatest challenges your organization faces when implementing strategic plans such as succession programs? So I know we've discussed some mistakes, anticipated mistakes, but these are broader challenges that have to do with strategic planning in general. So time, buy-in, knowledge, taking a standardized approach, having a dedicated team, or being able to commit long term to your strategic plan. I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to answer this one. All right, I really appreciate your participation throughout all of our polls. Again, hearing your responses really helps us to understand what information we should be prioritizing. All right, so it looks like many of you feel that your organization's greatest challenge is time. All right, but there are varied responses for the rest of them as well. So I'd like to note at this point that you may want to consider working with one of our consultants to help your organization navigate its unique challenges. So we've helped many clients with similar challenges, and we draw on our expertise to provide you with a streamlined process. We also offer accountability and objectivity to help you achieve your goals. And this can also really help in keeping your leadership team and your other employees more engaged in the process. Now, in the poll, a lot of responses had to do with time, and we can really help with time as well because we do some of that heavier lifting behind the scenes, and we can make this a more smooth overall process for you. So, speaking of time, if you think that this is a major concern for your organization and it's perhaps unrealistic for you to commit to building a robust plan, we do offer a structured process here. And so, this is our succession planning launch. So, this involves two separate half day workshops, and it's a great option if succession planning is something that you don't have a ton of time to commit to. So, like I said, we do a lot of that heavier lifting behind the scenes, and you end up with the full succession plan by the end of it, which can really help you kickstart your internal succession efforts. So, if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be really happy to support you. All right, so thank you all for sticking with me this far. I know I've given you a lot of information. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Helen to kickstart the Q&A.
Thank you, Shruti. That was an excellent presentation. So we do have some questions that have trickled in here. I want to encourage you, though, if anything comes up as we're walking through them, feel free to continue posting questions. I'll keep moderating those, and we'll work our way through as many as we can. So the first one is, do you use any programs? So I'm going to assume that's like a software type of program. Feel free to post a follow-up question if it's not. Do you use any programs to manage the 6-step process for succession, or is each step managed manually or in a separate program?
So we do have our template library that has all the worksheets and templates that can support your program. And so often these are things that you can access based on software that you already have. So correct me if I'm wrong, Helen, but things like Adobe, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint. And so there's no specialized software beyond that. Helen, if you'd like to elaborate, please feel free.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. We have had people search things related to succession planning software. I would say those are few and far between. Most of our tools are ones that you are able to fill out manually and organize on whatever file folder system your company uses. However, the companies that we work with resort to Sigma as a type of succession planning program or software. So Shruti mentioned our launch. That's a full service program that covers all of the back end work, all of the organizing, the managing, the data analysis that normally a software or a type of program for something like customer relation management or HR, those are often set up on a software. In this case, that's what our consultants do because it's something that's so highly customized. So you can't as easily do it on a software. If you're wanting to do something step by step, we also offer consulting that's based on just an individual step or a custom combination. So for example, Shruti's talking about identifying critical roles. We've worked with companies just to do that step before too, and then that's a more small scale program that can be tailored to whatever the needs are of the individual organization. So not a program in the software sense. As Shruti mentioned, most of our stuff can just be accessed on Adobe Teams Office, but we are able to support the work that a software might usually do in other industries via the team that Sigma has available to support you. Okay, next question. What if all of the roles in my organization are critical?
Yep, good question. And so I mentioned earlier that this may seem like the case because a role in your organization probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't in some way valuable to your organization's functioning. Now, keep in mind that with identifying critical roles within the context of succession planning, you want to be able to narrow this list down so that the overall process is more manageable. So I would recommend using our questionnaire, and you can actually use as many pages of the questionnaire as you'd like. You're not restricted to the number of rows that we have on one page. You can just copy and paste and or print off as many as you'd like. So you can list all the roles in your organization, but then go through the evaluation process to learn more and consider each of those criteria in more detail. So take the time to really reflect and look into anything that you need to look into. I also recommend creating a succession management team at your organization. And so this can be helpful in many different ways. So first, this team will be considering a minimum threshold. So what is that total, what is the score that you'll be using to decide on the critical roles? And if you still have too many roles than you can realistically manage at once, then perhaps you need to come back together as a succession management team and talk about which you're going to prioritize. Now, another element that you need to consider here is what resources does your organization have to commit to succession planning? So, depending on the resources of your organization and your organizational needs and priorities, this will also inform the number. So, perhaps every role is critical, but remember, you can always go through multiple rounds of that succession planning if necessary.
Thank you. That's a great point. We've seen some of our clients do that, where in an ideal world, you have a succession plan for every role, but we've seen many clients do multiple iterations where they do a different phase to cover different levels of their criticality.
Yeah, that's a great point, Helen. So oftentimes with critical role identification, when we think about it, we think about it in the context of an ideal world, right? Like, okay, we're going to dedicate all of our resources to this, but oftentimes that's simply not the case. And so a lot of what I'm talking about today is to help you think about this in a more realistic and take a more realistic approach.
So the next question is a great follow-up to that. How many roles should we focus on to begin with?
Okay, so I guess it depends on what you mean by begin with. So if you mean how many roles should you even consider listing on the questionnaire, I would say go for as many roles as you'd like, because this can really help you to learn more about your about the roles in your organization and make sure that you don't have any blind spots or overlook any roles that are actually very critical to your organization's functioning. Now, if you mean begin with in the context of how many roles should I start with in the first round of succession planning, again, this will really depend on your organization's resources, so the time that you have to commit. And remember to keep in mind that there's a whole process here. So you'll be nominating those succession candidates, you'll be giving them development opportunities and resources for growth. And so you want to make sure that you are uh, you're able to provide those succession candidates with with as many resources as realistically possible. So again, I would recommend coming together with your succession management team and talking about what resources you do have, not only for identifying those critical roles and deciding on which to prioritize, but also for the next follow-up steps.
Great, thank you. All right, who should fill out the Identify Critical Roles questionnaire?
Yeah, great question. So what I want to caution your organization is don't put this all on one person. So oftentimes it'll be one person trying to do it all and then implementing it organization wide. Often this is not realistic for one person to be able to consider every single role. So this can be your senior leadership team, or your organization can create a succession management team that can come together and work on this questionnaire.
Great. Okay, I see we have 5 minutes left of our webinar, so we'll do one more question. How often should we reassess which roles are critical, assuming, of course, that organizations are dynamic and roles will be changing over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do offer a general guideline of anywhere from 6 months to 12 months. But of course, every organization is different. Your needs will be different, and the resources that you're able to commit to succession planning will be different. So 6 to 12 months is our general guideline, but some organizations may want to revisit the plan more often, and some may need a little bit more time in between succession rounds.
That's a great guideline. We also often tell clients if anything changes, that's a great time to reassess your critical roles and your succession plan overall, whether it's an organizational restructure or you've just hired new people into your team and your job descriptions might have shifted a bit.
Yep, definitely.
Okay, so with the last couple of minutes that we have, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping announcements for you. So first of all, if you liked what you saw here, head on over to the events tab on our website. We have webinars running every month for the remainder of the year. Most of them focus on different steps in the succession planning process or an overview of the entire process, but we do also have a couple of special features there. And if there's something that you'd like to see that isn't on there, please don't hesitate to send us an email. We want these sessions to be practical for you. So if you have questions that you'd like answered or topics you'd like us to explore, do let us know. If you are here to receive a professional development credit for SHRM or ATD, we need to know. So if you could please notify us, you'll see my email is there on the screen. You can either jot that down now or reference it in the slide deck that we'll send out. That would be great. Let me know, particularly for SHRM, you'll need an activity code and a certificate of completion to show that you were here. So I will send that to you via email. And last but not least, we have a feedback survey. We do read every response that is on this survey, and we adjust our webinars based on what you liked and what you didn't like. So if you have 2 minutes, if you could fill out that survey, that would be very much appreciated. And like we've said throughout the webinar, if there's anything that wasn't addressed, please follow up with us via email, either with Shruti or myself or the team in general. We'd be happy to speak more with you about any of the tools that were shared or questions that you have. So thank you, Shruti, very much for facilitating the session for us today. It was a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to join us today. We hope it was a great session. And we hope to see you sometime soon again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.